Number 10. Tomoyuki Yamashita. Yamashita Tomoyuki, also called Yamashita Habun, by name Taira of Malaya, born November 8, 1885, Kochi, Japan, died February 23, 1946, Manila, Philippines, Japanese general known for his successful attacks on Malaya and Singapore during World War II. After graduating from the Army Academy, 1905, and the Army War College, 1916, Yamashita was an officer for the Army General Staff Office. He rose rapidly through the ranks of the Imperial Army, eventually becoming the highest-ranking general of its Air Force. An able strategist, he trained Japanese soldiers in the technique of jungle warfare and helped conceive the military plan for the Japanese invasion of the Thai and Malay peninsulas in 1941–42. In the course of a 10-week campaign, Yamashita's 25th Army overran all of Malaya and obtained the surrender of the huge British naval base at Singapore on February 15, 1942. Soon afterward Yamashita was retired by Prime Minister Tojo Hideki to an army training command in Manchuria, and he did not see active service again until after Tojo's fall in 1944, when he was sent to command the defense of the Philippines. His forces were badly defeated in both the Leyte and the Luzon campaigns, but he held out until after the general surrender was announced from Tokyo in August 1945. Yamashita was tried for war crimes, and, though he denied knowing of atrocities committed under his command, he was convicted and eventually hanged. Number 9. Isoroku Yamamoto. Isoroku Yamamoto, perhaps Japan's greatest strategist and the officer who would contrive the surprise air attack on U.S. naval forces at Pearl Harbor, is born on this day in 1884. A graduate of the Japanese Naval Academy in 1904, Yamamoto worked as a naval attaché for the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C., from 1926 to 1927. During the next 15 years, he saw several promotions, from Vice Minister of the Japanese Navy to Commander-in-Chief of Japan's Combined Fleet in August 1941. Despite worsening Japanese-American relations, especially in light of Japan's alliance with Germany and Italy, Yamamoto initially opposed war with the U.S., mostly out of fear that a prolonged conflict would go badly for Japan. But once the government of Prime Minister Tojo Hideki decided on war, Yamamoto argued that only a surprise attack aimed at crippling U.S. naval forces in the Pacific had any hope of victory. He also predicted that if war with America lasted more than 1 year, Japan would lose. Yamamoto meticulously planned and carried out the Japanese airstrike on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor on Oahu Island, Hawaii, December 7, 1941. Waves of dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters descended on U.S. battleships, capsizing, destroying, or immobilizing several U.S. battleships within the first 30 minutes of the raid. The attack was a decided success, especially in catching the United States off guard, and resulted in the destruction of 180 U.S. aircraft and more than 3,400 American casualties. U.S. forces finally caught up with Yamamoto, though, when they ambushed his plane and shot him down over Bougainville Island in 1943. Yamamoto died having been right about two things: the effectiveness of aircraft carriers in long-range naval attacks and that Japan would lose a drawn-out struggle with the United States. Yamamoto was portrayed by Toshiro Mifune, in Akira Kurosawa regular, in 3 films: I Bombed Pearl Harbor, 1961, Admiral Yamamoto, 1968, and Midway, 1974. Number 8. Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov was the most successful Russian general in World War II. Zhukov effectively led the attack on Berlin in April, May 1945 and throughout the whole Russian campaign was known as the man who did not lose a battle. Zhukov was born in 1896 and he served as an officer in the Russian Imperial Army during World War I. After the Bolshevik victory in November 1917, Zhukov joined the Communist Red Army. He served as a cavalry commander during the Russian Civil War. After the Civil War had ended in Russia and relative calm had descended on the nation, Zhukov studied the use of armored warfare in battle. He had seen for himself, the cost in human lives of outmoded warfare, and he developed his own ideas on how armored vehicles could be used in combat. His knowledge and skill clearly impressed Joseph Stalin, who had used the purges to rid himself of many senior Red Army officers. In 1940, Zhukov was appointed Chief of Staff by Stalin. Zhukov knew that failure would not be tolerated by Stalin, neither would be getting on the wrong side of the leader. Operation Barbarossa cruelly exposed the Russian army for what it was at that time. The Germans surged on to Stalingrad in the south, got into the suburbs of Moscow and besieged Leningrad in the north. Zhukov's first great test was to save Moscow, which he did. He then used his expertise to destroy the German army at Stalingrad, which led to Field Marshal von Paulus surrendering his forces. From this surrender, the German forces would only be retreating back to Germany. Such was the devastating nature of this defeat. For the advance into occupied Eastern Europe, Zhukov used to his advantage the new T-34, a weapon that set new standards for tank design. The victory of the Russians at Kursk gave them a huge advantage over the Germans in terms of armored warfare. Zhukov was given the credit for the victory of the Russian forces over the Nazis and the battle for Berlin. Though a victory in military terms, the Russians had taken very many casualties in this battle. However, this victory sealed for Zhukov the title of the man who never lost a battle. In the aftermath of this victory, Zhukov, now a marshal in the army, headed the Russian occupation force. However, his success and fame was his undoing. Stalin could never tolerate someone in Russia being more famous than he was, or even threatening that fame. In 1946, Zhukov was demoted by Stalin to a regional post in Russia and he was sidelined. When Stalin died in 1953, Zhukov regained the prestige his career merited. In 1955, he was appointed first Deputy Minister of Defense. In 1957, he was promoted to the Executive Committee of the Communist Party. However, he was sacked from both positions in 1957 when he was accused of putting the military before the party. From 1965 to 1968, Zhukov wrote articles for Russian periodicals, but their content would have been heavily censored by the government. Other than that, the man who effectively led the Russian military during World War II, led a quiet life in retirement. Gregory Zhukov died in 1974, aged 78. Number 7. Konstantin Rokossovsky. Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky, Rokossovsky also spelled Rokossovsky, born December 21, December 9, Old Style, 1896, Veliky Luki, Russia. Died August 3, 1968, Moscow, Soviet military commander noted for his role in the Battle of Stalingrad, 1942–43. Rokossovsky, whose father was a railroad engineer, served in the Imperial Army as a non-commissioned officer in World War I. In 1917 he joined the Red Army and served in the Civil War, rising through the ranks to various Far Eastern commands, notably leading a cavalry brigade during the Soviet-Chinese dispute over control of the Chinese Eastern Railway, 1929. He was imprisoned in 1938 during the Stalinist purges but was released upon the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 because his military talents were needed. During World War II, Rokossovsky had major roles in the battles at Moscow, 1941, Stalingrad, and Kursk, 1943, as well as in the Soviet drives into Byelorussia, 1944, East Prussia, and Pomerania, 1945. He won his greatest renown at Stalingrad when he directed 6 Soviet armies of the Don River front that, along with other Soviet forces, first trapped and then annihilated the 22 divisions of the German 6th Army. In 1949 he was named Soviet Defense Minister and Deputy Chairman of the Council of Ministers of Soviet-dominated Poland and was accorded the title Marshal of Poland. He held these positions until the return to power of W. Adis Ka, former secretary of the Communist Polish Workers' Party, who had been imprisoned in 1948. Upon his expulsion by Ka, October 28, 1956, on charges of attempting to stage a pro-Soviet coup, Rokossovsky returned to the USSR, where he was Deputy Minister of Defense, 1956–62, and held various other military posts. Number 6. Guy Simonds. The son of a British officer who immigrated to Canada, Guy Simonds was too young to serve in World War I. Between 1921 and 1925, he studied at the Royal Military College in Kingston, Ontario, and graduated with honors, the recipient of several awards for his academic successes, his behavior and discipline. Simonds joined the Canadian Permanent Force in 1926, serving with the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery in Petawawa and Winnipeg. Between 1936 and 1938, the young captain furthered his education at the Staff College in Camberley, England. Noted for his intelligence and his thorough understanding of military theory as well as of problems specific to modern warfare, Simonds was honored upon graduating with a laudatory recommendation from the college's commanding officer. Back to Canada, Simonds joined the staff of the Royal Military College in the spring of 1938. His papers on mechanized warfare, published in the Canadian Defence Quarterly, confirmed his status as one of the most brilliant thinkers in the Canadian military. After the proclamation of the state of war on September 10, 1939, Simonds, then a major, was appointed as General Staff Officer Grade 2 with the 1st Infantry Division and, in December 1939, stationed in England with his division. In July 1940, Simonds was posted with the 1st Field Regiment of the Royal Canadian Artillery, a demoralized unit just out of the Dunkirk evacuation. He was to remain there for only a short while. In November 1940, General Andrew MacNaughton asked Simonds to set up an intensive training program for officers, the Canadian Junior War Staff Course. Highly regarded for his remarkable military and planning skills, Simonds rose through the hierarchy at lightning speed, General Staff Officer, Grade 1, with the 2nd Infantry Division in May 1941, Commander of the 1st Infantry Brigade in September 1942, Commander of the 1st Canadian Infantry Division in April 1943, he was by then a Major General. Simonds' first combat experience dates back to the invasion of Sicily as he was commanding the 1st Infantry Division. Having skillfully organized his tanks, artillery and infantry, and led his troops with confidence through the battles of Nasoria, Aguirre and Rigalbuto, he was noticed by the commander of the 8th Army, General Bernard Montgomery. From November 1, 1943, to January 29, 1944, Simonds was at the head of the 5th Canadian Armoured Division. In January 1944, he was promoted to Lieutenant General and General Officer commanding of 2 Canadian Corps, that he had to train in preparation for D-Day. 2 Canadian Corps set up its HQ in France in July 1944, at a time when the Normandy campaign seemed to be getting bogged down. In July and August, Simonds headed 4 important operations against German positions: Atlantic, Spring, Totalize, and Tractable. These were difficult operations against an enemy bitterly fighting for each square inch of a terrain with which it was familiar. Despite the lukewarm success of Operation Totalize on August 7, Simonds' strategy was remarkable by its cleverness in neutralizing German armored vehicles and anti-tank defenses. It was then that Simonds invented the Kangaroo, an improvised troop carrier made by taking the guns off a Priest self-propelled gun. Operation Tractable on August 14 allowed Canadian and Polish troops to close the Falaise Gap. On September 27, 1944, Simonds took charge of the 1st Canadian Army on a temporary basis, in replacement of General H.D.G. Carrère. The liberation of the mouth of the Scheldt River was once again an opportunity for him to display his remarkable tactical intelligence. His firm leadership made a favorable impression on Montgomery. Carrère, however, took back his post with the 1st Army and Simonds resumed his command of 2 Canadian Corps for the liberation of northwestern Europe. After the war, Simonds remained in England with the Imperial Defence College. He returned to Canada as Commandant of both the Canadian Army Staff College and the National Defence College in 1949. Between 1951 and 1955, he served as Chief of the General Staff and reorganized the Canadian Army in preparation for the Korean War and later for NATO operations. Guy Simonds was outstanding among Canadian officers who took part in World War II. Montgomery regarded him as being, among Canadians, the only general fit to hold high command in war. U.S. General Omar Bradley called him the best of the Canadian generals and British General Sir Miles Dempsey the best of my corps commanders. In his book The Generals, historian Jack Granatstein wrote that Guy Simonds was for his contemporaries and for historians alike the best World War II Canadian soldier. Guy Granville Simonds, born in Bury St Edmunds, England, on April 23, 1903, died in Toronto on May 15, 1974. Canadian Army Officer, No. 5. Bernard Law Montgomery. British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, 1887–1976, was among the most decorated military leaders of World War II. Tapped to take command of the 8th Army, he earned renown for his part in the first major Allied land victory at El Alamein, Egypt, in 1942. Montgomery became ground commander of the Anglo-American forces under Dwight D. Eisenhower, and his insistence that invasion forces be increased from 3 to 8 divisions was essential to the Allies' success on D-Day in 1944. After the war, Montgomery served as chief of the Imperial General Staff, and later as deputy to Eisenhower at NATO. Contenders for the title are few, but Monty was indisputably Britain's greatest soldier since Wellington. He was better known for his outstanding professionalism and sense of balance than for his talents in getting on with his contemporaries, notably the American ones. Fourth of 9 children in a clerical Irish family of modest means, his early life suffered from a domineering mother. In October 1914, at the First Battle of Ypres, Montgomery, a young lieutenant, was shot through the lung and nearly died. He received the Distinguished Service Order, an unusually high distinction for a junior officer. His wound led to an aversion for smoking, one of the first causes of friction with the chain-smoking Allied Supreme Commander in World War II, General Ike Eisenhower. He was also a strict teetotaler. The horrendous British casualties in 1914–1918 help explain Montgomery's caution as a commander 25 years later. This once caused George S. Patton, who hated him, to damn Monty as a tired little fart. In the interwar period, Monty stood out for his dedication to professionalism. His uncompromising standards, and abrasiveness, were to affect his promotion. In 1927, at age 39, he married a war widow, Betty Carver, who tragically died of a rare blood infection in 1937. Monty never recovered, throwing himself even more fiercely into preparing for the new war with Germany. In 1940, he led the 3rd Division, one of Britain's few elite formations, intact from Dunkirk. The next 2 years he spent retraining the British Army, with the utmost rigor, in southern England. When appointed to command the defeated 8th Army in Egypt in August 1942, he was only Winston Churchill's second choice. El Alamein, in October, the first major land victory the Allies won against Adolf Hitler, made him a hero both in Britain and the United States. It also went to his head. Nevertheless, sporting the famed black beret with its unorthodox twin-cap badges, he exploited popularity to inspire his men as did perhaps no other commander of World War II. His insistence that the initial invasion forces be increased from 3 to 8 divisions, of which 3 were airborne, was a historic contribution. It was essential to success on D-Day in 1944, as was his role as ground commander of the Anglo-American forces under Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander. But failure to capture Cannes in the first days marred his reputation in U.S. eyes. Rashly he insisted that everything was going according to plan, yet it was his basic strategy of wearing down the Germans on the left, British, of the line while Bradley's U.S. forces broke out in the west that led to victory in Normandy. Relations with Ike, remarkably good up to D-Day, deteriorated beginning in September 1944, following Eisenhower's assumption of overall command over strategies to end the war. The bold but disastrous airborne coup at Arnhem, the only battle Monty ever lost, further dented his reputation. In turn, he was tactlessly critical of the American reverse in the Ardennes of December 1944. After 1945, Montgomery became chief of the Imperial General Staff, Britain's top military post, and later deputy to Eisenhower at NATO. The gulf between the two widened irretrievably in later years as both indulged in mutual recriminations on wartime strategy in their bitter battle of the memoirs. The Reader's Companion to Military History. Edited by Robert Cowley and Jeffrey Parker. Copyright 1996 by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt Publishing Company. All rights reserved. Number 4. Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur, 1880–1964, was an American general who commanded the Southwest Pacific in World War II, 1939–1945, oversaw the successful Allied occupation of post-war Japan and led United Nations forces in the Korean War, 1950–1953. A larger-than-life, controversial figure, MacArthur was talented, outspoken and, in the eyes of many, egotistical. He graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1903 and helped lead the 42nd Division in France during World War I, 1914–1918. He went on to serve as Superintendent of West Point, Chief of Staff of the Army and Field Marshal of the Philippines, where he helped organize a military. During World War II, he famously returned to liberate the Philippines in 1944 after it had fallen to the Japanese. MacArthur led United Nations forces during the start of the Korean War, but later clashed with President Harry Truman over war policy and was removed from command. In 1903, MacArthur graduated at the top of his class from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. As a junior officer in the years leading up to World War I, he was stationed in the Philippines and around the United States, served as an aide to his father in the Far East and participated in the American occupation of Veracruz, Mexico, in 1914. After the United States entered World War I in 1917, MacArthur helped lead the 42nd Rainbow Division in France and was promoted to Brigadier General. From 1919 to 1922 Douglas MacArthur served as the superintendent of West Point and instituted a variety of reforms intended to modernize the school. In 1922 he wed socialite Louise Cromwell Brooks, circa 1890 to 1965. The two divorced in 1929, and in 1937 MacArthur married Jean Fairclough, 1898 to 2000, with whom he had one child, Arthur MacArthur IV, the following year. In 1930 President Herbert Hoover, 1874 to 1964, named MacArthur Chief of Staff of the Army, with the rank of General. In this role, MacArthur sent Army troops to remove the so-called bonus army of unemployed World War I veterans from Washington, D.C., in 1932. The incident was a public relations disaster for MacArthur and the military. In 1935, after finishing his term as Chief of Staff, MacArthur was tasked with creating an armed force for the Philippines, which became a Commonwealth of the United States that year, and gained independence in 1946. In 1937, upon learning he was scheduled to return for duty in the United States, MacArthur resigned from the military, stating that his mission wasn't finished. He remained in the Philippines, where he served as a civilian advisor to President Manuel Quezon, 1878 to 1944, who had appointed him Field Marshal of the Philippines. In 1941, with expansionist Japan posing an increasing threat, Douglas MacArthur was recalled to active duty and named commander of U.S. Army forces in the Far East. On December 8, 1941, his air force was destroyed in a surprise attack by the Japanese, who soon invaded the Philippines. MacArthur's forces retreated to the Bataan Peninsula, where they struggled to survive. In March 1942, on orders from President Franklin Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, MacArthur, his family and members of his staff fled Corregidor Island in PT boats and escaped to Australia. Shortly afterward, MacArthur promised, "I shall return." U.S. Philippine forces fell to Japan in May 1942. In April 1942, MacArthur was appointed Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Southwest Pacific and awarded the Medal of Honor for his defense of the Philippines. He spent the next 2.5 years commanding an island-hopping campaign in the Pacific before famously returning to liberate the Philippines in October 1944. Wading ashore at Leyte, he announced, "I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil." In December 1944, he was promoted to the rank of General of the Army and soon given command of all Army forces in the Pacific. On September 2, 1945, MacArthur officially accepted Japan's surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. From 1945 to 1951, as Allied commander of the Japanese occupation, MacArthur oversaw the successful demobilization of Japan's military forces as well as the restoration of the economy, the drafting of a new constitution and numerous other reforms. In June 1950, Communist forces from North Korea invaded the Western-aligned Republic of South Korea, launching the Korean War. Douglas MacArthur was put in charge of the American-led coalition of United Nations troops. That fall, his troops repelled the North Koreans and eventually drove them back toward the Chinese border. MacArthur met with President Truman, who worried that the Communist government of the People's Republic of China might view the invasion as a hostile act and intervene in the conflict. The general assured him the chances of a Chinese intervention were slim. Then, in November and December 1950, a massive force of Chinese troops crossed into North Korea and flung themselves against the American lines, driving the U.S. troops back into South Korea. MacArthur asked for permission to bomb Communist China and use nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan against the People's Republic of China. Truman flatly refused these requests, and a public dispute broke out between the two men. On April 11, 1951, Truman removed MacArthur from his command for insubordination. In an address to Americans that day, the president stated, "I believe that we must try to limit the war to Korea for these vital reasons, to make sure that the precious lives of our fighting men are not wasted, to see that the security of our country and the free world is not needlessly jeopardized, and to prevent a third world war." MacArthur had been fired, he said, so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy. MacArthur's dismissal set off a brief uproar among the American public, but Truman remained committed to keeping the conflict in Korea a limited war. Eventually, the American people began to understand that MacArthur's policies and recommendations might have led to a massively expanded war in Asia. In April 1951, Douglas MacArthur returned to the United States, where he was welcomed as a hero and honored with parades in various cities. On April 19, he gave a dramatic televised address before a joint session of Congress in which he criticized Truman's South Korean policy. The general ended with a quote from an old army song, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." MacArthur and his wife took up residence in a suite at New York City's Waldorf Astoria Hotel. In 1952, there were calls for MacArthur to run for president as a Republican. However, the party ultimately chose Dwight Eisenhower, 1890 to 1969, who went on to win the general election. That same year, MacArthur became chairman of Remington Rand, a maker of electrical equipment and business machines. MacArthur died at age 84 on April 5, 1964, at Walter Reed Army Hospital in Washington, D.C. He was buried at the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia, No. 3. George Patton. Educated at West Point, George S. Patton, 1885 to 1945, began his military career leading cavalry troops against Mexican forces and became the first officer assigned to the new U.S. Army Tank Corps during World War I. Promoted through the ranks over the next several decades, he reached the high point of his career during World War II, when he led the U.S. 7th Army in its invasion of Sicily and swept across northern France at the head of the Third Army in the summer of 1944. Late that same year, Patton's forces played a key role in defeating the German counterattack in the Battle of the Bulge, after which he led them across the Rhine River and into Germany, capturing 10,000 miles of territory and liberating the country from the Nazi regime. Patton died in Germany in December 1945 of pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure following an automobile accident. George Patton's early life and career. George Smith Patton was born in 1885 in San Gabriel, California. His family, originally from Virginia, had a long military heritage, including service in the Civil War. Patton decided early on that he wanted to carry on the tradition, and graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1909. Patton gained his first real battle experience in 1915, when he was assigned to lead cavalry troops against Mexican forces led by Pancho Villa along the U.S.-Mexico border. He served as aide-de-camp to General John J. Pershing, commander of American forces in Mexico, and accompanied the general on his unsuccessful 1916 expedition against Villa. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Patton went along with Pershing to Europe, where he became the first officer assigned to the newly established U.S. Tank Corps. He soon earned a reputation for his leadership skill and knowledge of tank warfare, particularly after U.S. and British troops emerged victorious from the first major tank battle at Cambrai in France. After the war, Patton served positions in tank and cavalry units at various posts in the United States. By the time the country began to rearm itself in 1940, he had risen through the ranks to colonel. Soon after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Patton was given command of the 1st and 2nd Armored Divisions and organized a training center in the California desert. Patton headed to North Africa late in 1942 at the head of an American force. Before the initial landings on Morocco's Atlantic coast, he presented his troops with an expression of his now legendary philosophy of battle: "We shall attack and attack until we are exhausted, and then we shall attack again." Patton's lust for battle would earn him the colorful nickname Old Blood and Guts among his troops, whom he ruled with an iron fist. With this formidable aggression and unrelenting discipline, the general managed to put U.S. forces back on the offensive after a series of defeats and win the war's first major American victory against Nazi-led forces in the Battle of Algetra in March 1943. A month later, Patton turned over his command in North Africa to General Omar Bradley in order to prepare the U.S. 7th Army for its planned invasion of Sicily. The operation was a smashing success, but Patton's reputation suffered greatly after an incident in an Italian field hospital in which he slapped a soldier suffering from shell shock and accused him of cowardice. He was forced to issue a public apology and earned the sharp reprimand from General. Though he had greatly hoped to lead the Allied invasion of Normandy, Patton was instead publicly assigned command of a fictitious force that was supposedly preparing for an invasion in southeastern England. With the German command distracted by a phantom invasion of Pas-de-Calais, France, the Allies were able to make their actual landings on the beaches of Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944. After the First Army broke the German line, Patton's Third Army swept through the breach into northern France in pursuit of Nazi forces. Late that year, it played a key role in frustrating the German counterattack in the Ardennes during the massive Battle of the Bulge. In early 1945, Patton led his army across the Rhine River and into Germany, capturing 10,000 miles of territory and helping to liberate the country from Nazi rule. In the months following Germany's surrender, the outspoken general caused another firestorm of controversy when he gave an interview criticizing the Allies' rigid denazification policies in the defeated country. Eisenhower removed him from command of the Third Army in October 1945. That December, Patton broke his neck in an automobile accident near Mannheim, Germany. He sustained spinal cord and neck injuries and passed away from pulmonary embolism as a result of the accident in a Heidelberg hospital 12 days later. Patton's memoir, titled War as I Knew It, was published posthumously in 1947. His larger-than-life persona later made its way to the silver screen in an Academy Award-winning 1970 biopic starring George C. Scott. Number 2. Erich von Manstein. Erich von Manstein, original name Erich von Lewinsky, born November 24, 1887, Berlin, Germany. Died June 11, 1973, Reichenhausen, near Munich, Germany. German field marshal who was perhaps the most talented German field commander in World War II. The son of an artillery general, he was adopted by General Georg von Manstein after the untimely death of his parents. Manstein began his active career as an officer in 1906 and served in World War I on both the Western and Russian fronts. Rising through the ranks, he was promoted to Major General in 1936 and to Lieutenant General in 1938. At the start of World War II, he served as Chief of Staff to General Gerd von Rundstedt in the invasion of Poland, 1939. Manstein had in the meantime devised a daring plan to invade France by means of a concentrated armored thrust through the Ardennes forest. Though this plan was rejected by the German High Command, Manstein managed to bring it to the personal attention of Adolf Hitler, who enthusiastically adopted it. After leading an infantry corps in the assault on France in June 1940, Manstein was promoted to general that month. He commanded the 56th Panzer Corps in the invasion of the Soviet Union, 1941, and nearly captured Leningrad. Promoted to command of the 11th Army on the Southern Front, September 1941, Manstein managed to take 430,000 Soviet prisoners, after which he withstood the Soviet counteroffensive that winter and went on to capture Sevastopol in July 1942. Soon after, he was promoted to Field Marshal. He almost succeeded in relieving the beleaguered 6th Army in Stalingrad in December 1942, January 1943, and in February 1943 his forces recaptured Kharkiv, in the most successful German counteroffensive of the war. Thereafter he was driven into retreat, and in March 1944 he was dismissed by Hitler. Manstein spent the rest of the war on his estate and was captured by the British in 1945. He was tried for war crimes, and, though acquitted of the most serious charges, was imprisoned until his release in 1953 because of ill health. He subsequently advised the West German government on the organization of its army. His memoirs were published as Verlorene Siege, 1955, Lost Victories, No. 1. Erwin Rommel. German World War II Field Marshal. Erwin Johannes Eugen Rommel gained immortality in the North African Campaign of 1941–1943. Sent with a small German force to help the Axis against the British after the Italians had suffered severe defeat, Rommel reaching Tripoli in February 1941 was soon master of Cyrenaica and imposing his will on the enemy. For 2 years the opposing forces alternately advanced or withdrew over the desert, and Rommel's name became legendary, a master of mobile operations who was rapid, courageous, and audacious. Rommel's supreme achievement was his defeat of the British at Gazala in May 1942, followed by the taking of Tobruk and a field marshal's baton. Nemesis came 5 months later at El Alamein, when the British Imperial Army under Bernard Montgomery won a convincing victory. Rommel withdrew the survivors of his Panzer Army to Tunisia. By then the British and Americans had landed in North Africa, the British Eighth Army had reconquered Tripolitania and was on the Tunisian border, and the Germans were hemmed in, isolated and facing overwhelming odds. Rommel left for Europe in March 1943. The African adventure was over. Rommel has been criticized for lacking strategic sense, for excessive absorption in the tactical battle, for neglect of logistics, for periodic imprudence. These criticisms are shallow. Rommel's especial flair was undoubtedly for the battle itself, for the cut and thrust of maneuver, for personal leadership at the point of decision, above all for the speed and energy with which he decided and acted, but in his extensive writings and recorded conversations he showed a military perceptiveness and strategic insight that would have probably enabled him to shine with the brilliance of Erich von Manstein had he held high command on the larger scale of the Eastern Front. As to logistics, Rommel was acutely aware of them at all times. They dominated the African theater where all commodities had to be imported and transported over huge distances. He refused, however, to make excessively pessimistic assumptions or to over-insure or, as he put it, to allow the scope and pace of battle to be dictated by quartermasters. A more cautious approach would have often denied him victory. And although Rommel sometimes underestimated the timing and difficulties of an operation, he was one who believed war seldom forgives hesitation or delay. From his earliest days as a brilliant young leader in World War I, or as a Panzer Divisional commander crossing the Meuse against fierce opposition and racing across France in 1940, he had proved to himself the virtues of initiative and boldness. On the whole his decisions were justified by victory, and in Africa victory often against odds. Rommel's last military appointment was in command of Army Group B, responsible in 1944 for much of Northwest Europe. His energetic preparations reflected his conviction that the expected invasion had to be defeated near the coast, because Allied air power would nullify large-scale armored counter-operations after the landing. He believed, too, that the coming campaign should aim to defeat the invasion for one purpose, so that in the aftermath, peace might be negotiated in the West and a stalemate achieved in the East. Politically this was fantasy and militarily it failed, but for Rommel it was the only rational hope. By then Rommel had lost all faith in Adolf Hitler. Hitler had showed him favor, and Rommel was long grateful for what he saw as Hitler's restoration of German self-respect in the 1930s, but by 1944 he was disenchanted by Hitler's refusal to face strategic facts. After the Allied invasion had succeeded in establishing a front, see D-Day, Rommel, who believed that Germany must now inevitably lose a war on two fronts, tried again personally to confront Hitler with reality. He failed. Rommel, therefore, was now determined to surrender the German forces in the West unilaterally. Before that could happen he was wounded in an air attack on July 17. At home on sick leave, he was visited by emissaries of Hitler on October 14 and offered the choice of trial for high treason or suicide to be publicized as a heart attack with guarantees for his family's immunity. He had never participated in the plot to assassinate Hitler, but his defeatism was known and his involvement presumed. He chose suicide and was given a state funeral. Rommel has been variously described as a Nazi, because of long personal devotion to Hitler, or as a martyr of the German resistance, because of the manner of his death. He was neither. He was a straightforward, gifted, patriotic German officer, a charismatic commander and master of maneuver, caught up in the disaster of the Third Reich.